giving this opportunity. Today I'm going to talk about surgical patient and nutrition. Let's go to the first slide. Today we are going to discuss the importance of nutrition care in surgical patient and nutritional assessment, nutrition requirements, how to calculate nutrition requirements, and what are the methods we are using to provide nutrition, and at the same time complications of feeding. Next slide, please. So, why nutrition is important in surgical patient? That will the proper nutrition or nutritional optimization will reduce surgical mortality and complications and infection, and it will reduce the proper nutrition will support the depleted patient throughout the catabolic phase of recovery, and it will reduce length of hospital stay and speed of, it will increase the speed of healing and recovery process, and at the same time it will ensure the prompt return of GI function to resume standard oral intake as soon as possible. And in perioperative nutrition support, if the patient is malnourished, how long it will take to optimize the patient? Usually, if the patient is severely or moderately malnourished, it will take about 1 to 2 weeks, at least 1 to 2 weeks to optimize the patient. And are we using parenteral nutrition routinely after GI surgery? Obviously, the answer is not. All of you know it, and we use, if we, first of all, we try oral normal food. If you can't achieve the target of at least 60% of the target within 1 week, then we go for enteral nutrition. Then if you can't achieve 60%, at least 60% within 1 week through enteral nutrition, then only we consider supplemental therapies. Nutrition care delivery process, we follow 4 steps: nutrition screening, assessment, diagnosis, and nutrition care plan. So you don't expect us to provide nutrition care for all the patients in the hospital. So some sort of screening tool is applied. Whether you, there are accepted and validated tools. The commonly used tool is NRS 2002, Nutrition Risk Score. And then we go for nutritional assessment. That it contains many steps. I will discuss it. And at the same time, then we go. Next step is we are coming to a nutritional diagnosis, and then we plan the nutrition care and implementation. Next slide, please. So this is a NRS 2002 Nutrition Risk Screening tool. It contains 2 steps. Initial screening is the first step. If any answer is yes for one of these questions, then we go for next step. Right? So whether the BMI is less than 20, or whether the patient has lost his weight during last 3 months, during last week, or severe illness. So if any question, if the answer is yes for any of these questions, we go for the next step. This is the final screening of NRS 2002. We consider 2 main factors: nutritional status and disease severity. Depending on the condition, we give marks. This if food intake is less than, current intake is 50 to 70% of usual, 50 to 70% of usual intake, we give only 1 mark. And weight loss more than 5%, we consider a significant weight loss if it is more than 5%. So if it is within 3 months, we give 1 mark. If it occurs within 2 months, we give 2 marks. If it occurs within 1 month, then we give 3 marks, like that. And disease severity also like that. For the hip fracture, cirrhosis, and chronic diseases, we give only 1 mark. But for major abdominal surgery, severe pneumonia, we give 2 marks. And hematological malignancies as well. And for this head injury, burns, we give 3 marks. So, and all ICU patients. So, usually all ICU patients, if the total score is more than 3, we consider it as at risk of malnutrition. At risk of malnutrition. Or nutritionally at risk. That is the initial screening. For this screening process, actually, no need of having a medical officer, even a paramedical person can do this screening process. Then we'll go for the next step. That is nutritional assessment. It has 4 aspects: anthropometry, biochemical, clinical, and dietary. So, under the anthropometric, we commonly use this measurement of weight, height, and with that we calculate BMI, then mid-upper arm circumference, back, and calf circumference, and waist circumference. By this anthropometric measurement, we calculate waist to hip ratio or waist to height ratio, BMI. So those are the anthropometric measurements. Then under the biochemical markers, we use hemoglobin, albumin level, pre-albumin level, and serum iron studies. Under the laboratory, other laboratory investigation, we do calorimetry, indirect calorimetry, and BIA. BIA is bioimpedance analysis. And another investigation called BIVA. Then under the assessment, we do clinical. As medical officers, doctors, we used to do clinical assessment, head to toe. These hair changes and skin changes, and paloglossitis, angular stomatitis, and mitoid spots, muscle wasting from facial muscles, limb muscles. So all these clinical findings are taken under the assessment. Then most important thing, dietary assessment. So usually we take 24-hour dietary record, but in the hospital setup, it is not a successful method because they don't practice their usual dietary pattern when they are inside the hospital. In that case, we use food frequency questions. Like, for example, we ask how many times you eat fish per week, how many times you eat fruits per week, like that. We ask food frequency questions. So these are the steps of assessment. Next slide, please. So after doing this assessment, we come to a diagnosis, nutritional diagnosis. Whether this patient is malnourished or not. If he is malnourished, whether the grade of malnutrition, whether it is severe malnutrition or moderate malnutrition. So the latest criteria is GLIM criteria, so which is formed by ESPEN, European Society of Enteral and Parental. We consider 2 aspects: phenotypic criteria and disease severity. 2 categories. I'm not going to elaborate that. Next slide, please. So, who requires nutrition support? Patients already malnourished or patients who are at risk of malnutrition. These are the 2 categories we have to intervene. Next slide, please. So, this is the nutrition support algorithm do the assessment, you have to see whether functional gut is there. If gut is there, then we consider the enteral nutrition as the first option. If GI function is compromised, we have to use specialty formula, like this. We use this some semi-elemental formula in certain diseases like pancreatic insufficiency, malabsorption. We use semi-elemental. So that is one example. If GI function is not compromised, it is normal, we use standard nutrients. Then our target is when you are using standard, the next target is confused with a word enteral nutrition. So ideally, if we eat orally, so that is also we can consider it as enteral nutrition. But in these nutrition guidelines and textbooks, they use the word enteral nutrition for tube feeding. If the gut function is compromised, we use specialty formula, and as soon as possible, we are trying to. If that is not successful, then we go for parenteral nutrition supplementation, supplemental parenteral nutrition. While that enteral feeding, tube feeding is going on, we start supplemental parenteral nutrition. And our target is going for total enteral feeding as soon as possible. So, if the parenteral nutrition is for a short period, we can use the peripheral parenteral nutrition, and if it is for a long period, then we have to go for central parenteral nutrition. As soon as GI function returns, we are trying to establish the enteral nutrition. Next slide, please. So, what are the types of feeds? Maybe oral or tube feeding. Oral feeds we can classify as normal food or oral nutrition supplements. ONS means oral nutrition supplements. Those are the things which are available commonly. This, if I mention some brand names, this Sustagal, Protein X. Those are oral nutrition supplements. And then for tube feeding, we can use either blenderized kitchen food or therapeutic formula. But in these ASPEN and ESPEN guidelines, they don't recommend blenderized kitchen food for tube feeding. However, considering the cost and other factors, in Sri Lanka, we use blenderized kitchen feed. So, these therapeutic formula, we can divide into three: polymeric, oligomeric, and monomeric. This polymeric contains large molecules like protein. Then oligomeric or semi-elemental contains partially digested particles like peptides, and if you consider fat, MCT is there. And in monomeric, that is called elemental amino acids, the smaller, very small molecules. But this elemental formula is not available in Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. That is semi-elemental. It contains peptides. Only two products are there: peptamen and critical.
Is it because of the cost that elemental feeds are not available?
Yes, I think so. But amino acid capsules are there. But for
syrups are also there, but it's very important for patients with inflammatory bowel disease, sort of first-line treatment.
Because of due to severe malabsorption.
Crohn's disease. Even for fistula, they recommend elemental feeds as a therapy. They say that fistula
must be the reason, isn't it? Semi-elemental also not freely available. You have to do local ones. But at NHSL it is available. They have. So this is regarding the modes of feeding. This diagram is self-explanatory. If you are using parenteral route, we can use either peripheral parenteral nutrition or central parenteral nutrition. And tube feeding, if you use NACE, I think this crowd very well know this regarding this feeding better than me. So depending on the disease condition, disease condition means depending on the surgery, we have to use this kind of feeding method. Next slide, please. Nutritional requirements. How do we determine the energy and protein requirement of a surgical patient? So we have to consider three facts. Nutritional status of the patient, whether the patient is malnourished or not, whether the patient is obese or not. And, surgical stress, depending on the nature of the surgery, whether it is a major surgery, whether the gut is involved, whether pancreas is involved, whether the gallbladder is involved. So those factors we have to consider. And sometimes this major abdominal surgery we consider as moderate stress, but burns we consider as severe stress for the patient. So energy requirement is very high. And regarding the nutritional status also, I'll describe next slides. And comorbidities also we have to consider whether this patient is having diabetes. Then we have to adjust the energy requirement. And if you are doing a surgery for chronic kidney disease patient, sometimes this malignancy or your surgery demands more protein. But considering this chronic kidney disease, sometimes we have to restrict protein depending on the grading of the chronic kidney disease. Next slide, please. So, this is energy requirement according to the surgical stress. So, mild stressed, that is normal requirement, 25 to 30 kilocalories per kg. For the moderate, 30 to 35. And for the severe stress, like burn patient, they may need 30 to 40 kilocalories per kg per day. And protein intake 1 to 2 grams. That's a range depending on other factors we have to titrate it. Next slide, please. Nutritional requirements according to the nutritional status. Usually for moderately malnourished patient, we give 35 kilocalories per kg. And for the severe malnutrition, we provide 40 kilocalories per kg. That is as a start, but later on we can increase up to 100 kilocalories per kg. Depending on the severity of the malnutrition. Protein requirement, we calculate, we don't go beyond 20% of total energy. So that is the upper margin we maintain. And depending on other comorbidities, we titrate the protein requirement. Let's see the next slide. The nutritional requirement according to comorbidities. So for the diabetes and hypertension, we provide normal energy. There is a myth called if the patient is diabetic, we have to restrict calories, but we are not. We don't believe that. Furthermore, because that patient needs average energy. If patient is diabetic patient is malnourished, we have to provide according to malnutrition guidelines. Or sometimes patient may need 40 kilocalories per kg. Patient is severely malnourished. For the hypertension also same theory. If patient is obese, then of course we have to restrict calorie below the normal margin. And for chronic kidney disease, chronic liver disease and malignancy, patient needs high energy, sometimes 30, 40 kilocalories per kg. But protein requirement vary according to, now let's see, suppose that patient is having chronic kidney disease, up to stage 3B, we provide the normal amount of protein. So beyond that, we restrict protein. Stage 4, 5, we restrict protein. But if patient is on dialysis, then of course we have to increase protein up more than the normal requirement. Chronic liver disease also same. Unless patient is having features of encephalopathy, we don't restrict proteins. Next slide, please.
And
just like before, there is say 10 to 20% of total energy from proteins.
Yes.
Does that mean that your proteins are expected to supply part of the energy requirement, or is it?
When we are providing enteral nutrition, we consider it as a part of energy source. But for the parenteral nutrition, we don't consider it as a source of energy. So, how do you advance feeding? Usually, is usual practice, you start with clear liquids, then go for full liquids, and followed by solid foods. But this ESPN usually recommends early enteral feeding. So most of the time they recommend therapeutic formula straight away rather than clear fluid. But we don't practice it because most of the time surgeons don't recommend. They like to start clear fluid initially. Even for this bowel anastomosis patient, they recommend to start within 24 hours. But we take care not to start even the patient is in the ICU. This intensivist, anesthetist, and nutritionist all consider surgeon's opinion before starting feeds.
Day zero starting oral after bowel anastomosis is not prohibited. That is good. That improves gut circulation. If there is food and if gut functions, only sort of gut circulation also improves. That is healthy for the anastomosis.
Yes.
The reason why we delay is sort of when there is IBS, we want to make sure that gut is functioning. If there is IBS, what happens is sort of gut distends, accumulates further, and compromise blood. So the moment we know that gut function, feeding from day zero is acceptable. But if we give sort of small feeds, we give fluids to see they tolerate it. As they tolerate it, we upgrade.
Right.
And different parts of the gut recovers at different stages. If you are feeding through stomach, of course, sort of stomach takes some time to recover. Right? Like sort of small bowel recovers early.
Right.
We had a nasogenital or nasogastric feeding tube, of course. We can bypass stomach, like patients with pancreatitis if they don't tolerate. So we can pass an esophageal tube and sort of feed them. After esophageectomy, we can bypass that part and sort of feed them.
Right.
So we also recommend early feeding.
Nice to hear that. And one thing I could mention regarding this. As mentioned about this diurnal feeding, we can't, it is not recommended to give jejunum or duodenum. Below the stomach, we have to use continuous feed. For the continuous feed, we use either feeding pump, like your infusion pump, there are feeding pumps, we can use feeding pumps, or feeding bags, like saline bottle. But I have seen most of the time you practice hourly feeds, which is not mentioned in guidelines, but it should be either bolus feeding 2 hourly or 3 hourly, or continuous feed through a feeding pump. Next slide, please. And these are the contraindications for enteral nutrition. Support severe acute pancreatitis, small bowel obstruction, IBS or high output enteric fistula distal to feeding tube. If you can put a feeding tube, if you can put the distal end of the tube distal to the fistula, then of course you can continue tube feeding even though fistula is there. Inability to gain access, hemodynamic instability, need for high dose of vasopressors. So I have repeated the same thing. So these are the contraindications for enteral route. Next slide, please. feeding tube selection. We have to see whether patient can be fed into the stomach or small bowel. So depending on the feeding site, as said, we have to decide the tube. And how long we are going to keep the tube, that is also important. If it is for a long period, we don't use the nasogastric or nasogenital. If it is more than 4 weeks, usually it is recommended to insert peg or patch. Next slide, please. How to determine your enteral nutrition prescription. So we have to estimate energy, protein, and fluid needs. Then select most appropriate enteral formula. They don't talk about this kitchen food, blend-rice kitchen food. And determine continuous versus bolus feeding. So depending on the site, if it is jejunum, we have to consider continuous feeds. And determine goal. So this goal also very important. Sometimes we don't advance feeding at once. If patient is having high risk of feeding syndrome, we gradually advance feeding to prevent complications. And not only refeeding syndrome, then surgical team also have certain factors to consider regarding advancement of the feed. So depending on their recommendation, we gradually increase feeding. And considering all those facts, we write the enteral nutrition prescription. Next slide, please. In parenteral nutrition. So 2 types: this conventional parenteral nutrition and 3-in-1 pack that parenteral nutrition. So these are the main 2 categories we use here, but in certain countries I have seen in
Cabivan also contain carbohydrate, protein deficiency.
contains, but they are in separate. Yes, but we mix it and provide. But in conventional parenteral nutrition, we give in separate bottles. I don't know whether it is practiced here, but when we were students and when we were interns, we didn't have Cabivan. Then yes, and that is not tailor-made. Energy density also low and protein content also low, but it is made for mainly for peripheral lines. So, but in developed countries, they when we write the prescription in the laboratory, they make tailor-made formula. I mean, parenteral nutrition preparation. They mix everything and send within few minutes to the ward. So you have finished it within the recommended period.
Yeah, the advantage of that is having trace elements and vitamins.
That's right. Not only that, that protein and calorie requirement, that is tailor-made. Patients Cabivan, if you open a pack, if patient needs, suppose that patient is a child, calorie requirement may be 800. So Cabivan 1 pack contains 1000. You can't keep it open for more than 24 hours. The balance you have to discard. So that is disadvantage. So if adult patient, the patient needs 1500 kilocalories. You have to open 2 packs, but 500 kilocalories you have to discard. So that is the disadvantage of Cabivan, but even without central line, you can use it. So it is recommended carbohydrate, dextrose, you are up to 12.5%, you can use a peripheral line. And protein, it is not recommended to use a peripheral line, and lipids, whatever the strength, 10 or 20%. Lipofunding, you can use, you can provide through a peripheral line. Calculations, of course, I am not going to discuss it here. Next slide.
From the anesthesia, you can see this for central lines.
Yes.
TPA.
Yes.
I think the need is not for central line itself,
Yes.
but a cannula in a fast flowing way. So even an extracellular cannula
Yes.
is similar to a central line for total value.
All right.
That is plasmin ion concentration restores.
Yes.
Lower can like external.
This option is if you can get a peak line.
Peripherally inserted central.
Intercentral line, long term, safe, and it's in the and it's long term. I think we don't have that facility here in Sri Lanka to get a peak line. Because in the West, usually the gastroenterologist puts it. Himself, he puts the peak line. They have the very gas nutritionist, you all should start at least getting trained in inserting peak lines. It will be very useful for like short bowel syndrome and all. You can send the patient home with you, and you just have access to central line through the cubital fossa.
But you enter through a peripheral line.
And then you go to the subclavian
The problem with the nebulizer that goes to device in high concentration.
The osmolality is more than 900.
Which one is the best option for long term?
Parenteral nutrition and supplemental parenteral nutrition, I mentioned this earlier. Next slide, please. Access devices, as say, peripheral venous access, we use catheter placed percutaneously into peripheral vessels, central venous access, percutaneous jugular, femoral or subclavian, and implanted ports or PIC. Right, next one. For monitoring, when you are in parenteral nutrition, you have to monitor electrolytes daily, blood glucose sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and serum triglyceride and liver function once a week. Right. Then pre-albumin level, if possible, it's very expensive. I don't know whether it is done here. At least once a week. Why albumin is not recommended? Albumin
Can be affected by other factors.
yes, can be affected by other factors. At the same time, sir, it has a long half-life, 20 days. So you can't see short changes by doing albumin, but pre-albumin or transthyretin, the same name, it is comparatively better indicator. It's short half-life when you compare with albumin. And next slide, please. So, what are the dangers of feeding? If you overfeed, hyperglycemia, hepatic dysfunction from fatty infiltration, respiratory acidosis, and difficulty in weaning from the ventilator, refeeding syndrome. Refeeding syndrome, of course, I will describe a little bit. So, those are the risk of overfeeding. Then, and Bhavisa knows that when we are going to extubate patients, we restrict fluid and sometimes feeding, especially these patients with respiratory conditions in medical ICUs, they cut down fluid up to 80%, 70% when they want to extubate. They try to keep lung in dry side, and at the same time, feeding also we are going to minimize. And but sometimes this proper nutrition is important for the extubation because these the respiratory muscles are weak due to malnutrition. Then again, you can't extubate. And risk associated with underfeeding, depressed ventilatory drive, decreased respiratory muscle function, impaired immune function, and increased infection. Next slide. So, refeeding syndrome. So, this is a very common exam question. In nutrition and chemical pathology, I don't know, sometimes in medicine and anesthesia as well. Refeeding syndrome is a state severe electrolyte and fluid imbalance due to rapid feeding of a severely malnourished patient. So the mechanism is when you are starving, your sodium potassium ATPase pump is not functioning. So once you start feeding, this when you are starving, this pump is not functioning. So as a result, your sodium in intravascular compartment can go into cells without any disturb, and potassium come out from cells. So it is not regulated by the pump. So the potassium which comes out from cells will be excreted through urine, right? Through kidneys. So there's a depletion of potassium inside the body, and due to lack of energy, your phosphate level also low, right? Once you start feeding, this pump will start to work. So as a result, the sodium which was inside cell come out of the cell to the intravascular compartment, right? So with sodium, fluid retention is there, right? So that causes hypervolemia and heart failure. That is one mechanism. And potassium, there's a deplete. Potassium will taken up to the inside the cell. So as a result, hypokalemia occurs, and phosphate will be more utilized for the ATP and that mechanism. So hypophosphatemia will occur. So cardinal feature is hypophosphatemia in pre-feeding syndrome, hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia as well, and hyponatremia. So not hyponatremia, that is hypernatremia. Right? So fluid overload and hypokalemia, hypophosphatemia. So these all factors will cause arrhythmias and heart failure. So sudden death occur. This syndrome was first detected after the Second World War. These American soldiers who were rescued from this Nazi army they were kept starved for a long period, few months. Then once they were rescued and they were fed enthusiastically, most of them were died. Then they have investigated and detected this pre-feeding syndrome. I think so if the patient is having, we have assess the risk of pre-feeding syndrome before start feeding. If patient is kept fasting for a long period, or patient is having diabetes, or if the patient is alcoholic, then of course we have to start feeding gradually. Usually it is recommended if patient is having high risk of pre-feeding syndrome, start with 25% of the normal requirement and increase gradually by another 25% in 2 to 3 days time. So you should take at least 1 week to advance the feeding up to 100%. And you have to monitor sodium, potassium, phosphate and magnesium levels, baseline levels before start feeding. You have to correct it before start feeding if pre-feeding risk is very high, and monitor it at least for 1 week while you are feeding. So those are the things I wanted to present.
We have a problem of replacing phosphate.
Yes, sir.
What is the preparation that you recommend?
The phosphate buffer solution is there. It is available at NHSF, and we have requested the ministry to provide it for all hospitals, phosphate buffer solution.
That's better.
Yes, sir. But if the patient is taking parenteral nutrition, no option.
Most of our patients are having poor appetite. So what can we do with that?
Poor appetite, sir, then of course we have to consider if the patient is having micronutrient deficiency.
And how can we improve appetite? So can we feed them like NTPs or?
Yes, sir. In ESPN guidelines, they recommend if you can't achieve at least 50% of the requirement orally, then you have to consider tube feed. Actually, if you can't achieve normal requirement with normal food, then first step is oral nutrition supplements. Energy-dense food you can use. Not only supplements, even normal food you can use energy-dense food like pudding, matlapan, and those are energy-dense food. Even pre-portion, that is also energy-dense food. And we use for the pediatric group, we use this BP100 energy-dense biscuit like. So energy density is 1.5 kilocal per ml like, but in normal formulas, the strength is 1 kilocal per ml. But you can use up to 2 kilocal per ml formula there. energy formula there, and we use those formula even for tube feeding in fluid restrict patients who are having fluid restrictions, like CKD patients.
Are there stimulants like?
Yes, appetite stimulants are there, usually B-complex and lysine, those are recommended, and at the same time this famous is cyproheptadine, that is also even pediatricians use that. Yes. Rather than allowing patient to die with malnutrition, we can use solo these options.
The other thing is, you mentioned that we are screening categorization as BMI less than 20, considered one of the risk factors, is it?
That is, in the screenings, we can go for the second step if the BMI is less than 20. But BMI less than 20 is not the diagnostic criteria of malnutrition.
One of the criteria.
Yes, if the BMI is less than 18.5, in certain guidelines, it is recommended patient is malnourished. If it is less than 16, severe malnutrition. That is one criteria. But in the screening, less than 20, then you go for the next step. Sometimes you may encounter patients with normal BMI or higher BMI, but still, if you apply other criteria, patient can be considered as malnourished. If patient has lost his oral intake significantly during last 2 weeks, that is an indication for considered as malnutrition.
Is there a good food atlas of Sri Lanka to find out the calorie values and all?
Sorry.
Food atlas, where you have
Food
calorie
atlas.
values for Sri Lanka?
Yes, they are published by MRI. There is a color atlas, and another book published by Dr. Ranil Jayawardena. He's a PhD holder in nutrition attached to physiology department of the Colombo faculty. And he has recently published a color atlas of food, and it contains all calorie values and all things.
Sacrifice that until that sometimes we need to reduce sepsis as complications.
When the sepsis, this immunonutrient is recommended in major abdominal surgeries and in certain conditions like head injury and multiple fractures. Immunonutrients are recommended, which is arginine, glutamine, and omega-3 nucleotides, omega-3 fatty acids and nucleotides. So those are immunonutrients. Those are recommended in those conditions. But there is a controversy regarding sepsis and arginine. So arginine has effects of vasodilatation. So in sepsis, it's not recommended to start because of risk of septic shock.
Vitamin C and zinc.
Yeah, there's a study called HEAD studies, vitamin C and vitamin C. What is the other thing? I can't remember. No, sir. HEAD HAT then ascorbic acid and another two components, thiamine, vitamin C, and I can't remember the H. So HEAD therapy is recommended in severe sepsis. Okay. Thank you very much.